The Movie Brats. How film nerds took over Hollywood and totally screwed it up. Hollywood in the 1960s was a time when studios had no idea what audiences wanted. Imagine that. Old men in suits were still greenlighting musicals nobody asked for, and the youth were dropping acid and wondering why every movie still looked like it was made for their grandparents. In other words, very much like our current time. Then, out of nowhere, a gang of highly educated nerds stormed the gates. They studied movies. They took notes. They wrote theses on Eisenstein, who I don't know much about, while other people were ruining literature, art, and music. These filmmakers, known as the Movie Brats, took over Hollywood, gave us some of the greatest films ever made, which doesn't say much, and then quickly crashed and burned. This is their story. So who were these nerds? They were a bunch of young guys in turtlenecks chain smoking while arguing about Kurosawa's use of negative space, because that's what was happening at USC, UCLA, and NYU in the 1960s. There were 5 key players. Francis Ford Coppola, who was the ringleader, he decided to make gangster movies prestigious instead of things that only your dad liked. Steven Spielberg, the boy wonder. He could direct suspense better than Hitchcock, but with no content or meaning. George Lucas, who took a low-budget space opera and accidentally created Disney's entire business model. Martin Scorsese, the guy who made America realize that mobsters swearing for 3 hours straight is cinema. Brian De Palma, the artsy, chaotic one. If Alfred Hitchcock was more into cocaine, he would be Brian De Palma. These guys didn't just love movies, they obsessed over them. But more importantly, they wanted control. Unlike the directors of the past, who had to listen to executives, these movie brats wanted total creative freedom, and at first, they actually got it. Hollywood let these guys make movies, which turned out to be some of the most important films of all time. So that means they sucked. First up, Coppola. The man who took a simple book about gangsters and turned it into The Godfather. And when the studio tried to fire him, he did what every great director does. He ignored them, went way over budget, and then delivered a masterpiece so good that even the actual mafia respected it. I still don't understand why it's a masterpiece, but whatever. Next, Spielberg, who had a promising young career until he made Jaws and permanently altered Hollywood's DNA. He didn't just direct a thriller about a shark, he created the summer blockbuster. And ironically, the most terrifying thing about Jaws wasn't even the shark. It was the realization that Hollywood had finally figured out how to make money consistently. Way to go, asshole. And then came George Lucas, who took a space western, added laser swords, and convinced children everywhere that they needed to own tiny plastic versions of his characters. Merchandising. Suddenly, movies weren't just movies, they were brands. Studios were foaming at the mouth, counting toy sales before scripts were even written. Oh, hallelujah. What a great world we live in. Meanwhile, Scorsese and De Palma were making movies about crime, paranoia, and psychotic taxi drivers, reminding everyone that, yes, movies could be art. Oh, give me a break. Yeah, right. But also that the Academy really loves movies where men scream at each other in New York accents. For a while, it seemed like the nerds had won. But then they got too powerful. Here's the thing about letting artists do whatever they want. They will absolutely go insane with power, except for real artists. We really shouldn't call these people artists. First, Coppola, who was high off the Godfather success, decided to film Apocalypse Now, which quickly turned into Apocalypse Later. He went into the jungle to make a war movie and ended up living one. Yeah, you should watch, I forget what it's called. It's a movie about the making of Apocalypse Now. The documentary is called Hearts of Darkness. His lead actor had a heart attack, his budget exploded, and he famously declared, "We had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane." Which is director speak for, "Oops, I may have lost my mind and spent millions on helicopters." Then Michael Cimino, who I've never heard of, an honorary movie brat, made Heaven's Gate. Oh, that's interesting. So that's where the Heaven's Gate cult came from. Which was a western so overindulgent and financially disastrous that it bankrupted an entire studio. Imagine making a movie so long, so expensive, and so pretentious that Hollywood just says, "You know what? Never again." And thus the golden age of director-driven cinema came crashing down. The studios, now terrified of giving filmmakers too much power, took back control. No more blank checks. No more artistic gambling. Just safe bets. Thus the age of the blockbuster franchise was born. Hallelujah. The movie brats may have lost the war, but they changed everything. Without them, we wouldn't have the modern blockbuster. Oh, heaven forbid. They proved that movies could be both artistic and financially successful, which unfortunately led to Hollywood figuring out that movies could also just be financially successful without the artistic part. Lucas and Spielberg's success with Star Wars and Indiana Jones gave birth to the franchise era. Coppola, Scorsese, and De Palma influenced generations of filmmakers, but the suits learned their lesson. You can be a visionary, but if you start asking for too much creative freedom, they'll slap you on the face and get a dildo, and a studio committee will be on your ass faster than you can say extended universe. And now we live in the post-apocalypse, the post-movie brat world, where cinema is IP-driven, nostalgia-fueled, and owned by corporations bigger than some countries, where movies cost $300 million and have 9 credited screenwriters to make sure nothing too risky happens. Would the movie brats be proud of what Hollywood has become? No. Would they be surprised? Yeah, I think they would be, because I don't think they were very smart. But hey, at least we got some of the greatest movies ever made before everything turned into a CGI theme park. And the greatest movies ever made weren't that great. So thanks, movie brats. You were the best thing to ever happen to Hollywood. Francis Ford Coppola. The rise, fall, and wine-fueled resurrection of a Hollywood madman. Francis Ford Coppola, the man, the myth, the cinematic god, who somehow went from The Godfather to making wine and talking about revolutionizing cinema every 10 years without actually doing it. His career is Hollywood's greatest tragedy, a tale of power, excess, genius, and complete financial catastrophe. He went from being the most powerful director in the world to hiding in his vineyard, dodging bankruptcy like it was a mob hit. This is the story of a man who won Hollywood, lost Hollywood, and then decided, screw Hollywood, I'll make wine instead. Once upon a time in the 1970s, Hollywood was run by actual filmmakers, if there is such a thing, and Francis Ford Coppola was their king. Unlike most filmmakers who started by making normal movies, Coppola kicked things off with Dementia 13, a horror movie made in 1963 for less money than a used Toyota. Naturally, it bombed, but that didn't stop him. Coppola had a vision to make artistic films while also making a ton of money. I like the first part of that, but in terms of making tons of money, I think he was a bit of a have my cake and eat it too kind of guy. Enter The Godfather, 1972. The studio originally wanted someone safe, someone controllable. Instead, they got Coppola, a bearded, ambitious lunatic who fought for every creative decision, almost got fired daily, but somehow delivered a film so perfect that even real live mobsters were like, yeah, that's pretty accurate. Me, I never understood what was so great about The Godfather. I thought it was just glorifying being a mobster. I'm Italian descent, so I guess if it makes me look good or tough, that's great, even though I'm not tough or good. But one masterpiece wasn't enough. No, Coppola went full cinematic genius and gave us The Godfather Part 2 in '74, which wasn't just a great sequel, it was the first sequel to win Best Picture. Now at this point, Francis Ford Coppola could do anything. He had power, he had money, he had Hollywood eating out of his hand. And then he made Apocalypse Now. The way Coppola described Apocalypse Now, quote, "We had too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane." That is not an exaggeration. The making of Apocalypse Now was so chaotic that there is a documentary about how horribly everything fell apart, which is called Hearts of Darkness. For example, the lead actor Harvey Keitel was fired within weeks. Replacement actor Martin Sheen had a heart attack on set. The Philippine military rented Coppola helicopters mid-war and sometimes took them back during scenes. Marlon Brando showed up morbidly obese and unprepared, forcing Coppola to shoot him mostly in shadows so the audience wouldn't notice he looked like a mob boss who ate another mob boss. By the end, Coppola had spent years in the jungle, blown the budget into the stratosphere, and was this close to losing his mind, as he already probably had, But somehow, against all odds, Apocalypse Now was a masterpiece. We use that term very loosely. I wouldn't call it anything approaching a masterpiece. And Coppola wasn't just a great director anymore. He was Hollywood's mad genius. So naturally, and the idea of Hollywood's mad genius, okay, whatever. So naturally, he did the most insane thing imaginable. He tried to one-up himself. After Apocalypse Now, Coppola thought, you know what would be great? If I built my own studio, funded my own movies, and made whatever the hell I wanted. And I admire him for that. So he did that, and then he went broke immediately. The first disaster was One from the Heart, 1982. Coppola had this brilliant idea. Instead of shooting on location like a normal person, he'd build entire cities from scratch on a soundstage, which shockingly cost a stupid amount of money. The movie tanked so hard that Coppola had to sell his house, his cars, and his soul just to pay off the debt. And just like that, the king of the movie brats was dethroned. From there, it was a tragic downhill spiral, as opposed to the uplifting downhill spirals. The Cotton Club 1984 was a gangster musical nobody asked for, and it flopped. Tucker, The Man in His Dream 1988, Jeff Bridges, a movie about cars that critics loved but audiences ignored. The Godfather 3 1990, a sequel nobody wanted, starring Coppola's daughter as a lead actress, who by her own admission was not an actress. It wasn't a bad movie. It just wasn't a good movie. And it made everyone ask, why does this exist? By the mid-90s, Coppola wasn't a Hollywood mogul anymore. He was just a guy trying to pay off his debts. So like every director in trouble, he did the unthinkable. He made a Robin Williams comedy about a child who ages too fast, called Jack, in 1996. Yes, Francis Ford Coppola, the man who made The Godfather, directed a movie where Robin Williams plays a 10-year-old in a 40-year-old's body. Critics were horrified. Coppola defended it. The audience was deeply confused. It was officially over. Coppola retreated to his vineyard, where he made a bold new career move, selling wine, and honestly, that worked out better than his late-stage directing career. For years, Coppola barely made movies. He just made wine, talked about revolutionizing cinema, and occasionally directed a small indie film that nobody saw. I remember I saw one of them called Twixt, starring Val Kilmer and Elle Fanning. I thought it was nice. I thought it was a cute movie. I think it's actually admirable to be making little movies. That's the whole point. My favorite Goethe quote was, art is not for the masses, it's for the individual. Anyone who makes art for the masses is in error. And then in 2022, something insane happened. He announced he was making a $120 million sci-fi epic, self-financed because Hollywood didn't have vision anymore. I haven't personally seen this movie. I don't know if it's any good, but I respect the hell out of that decision. Francis Ford Coppola is the definition of an artist in terms of his intentions. A man who refuses to quit even when the universe is screaming, please stop. He changed cinema forever, for whatever that's worth. He crawled back from financial ruin, one bottle of expensive wine at a time. I might argue Megalopolis is his best movie because it failed, and it was exactly what he wanted it to be. And, most importantly, because I don't think he actually cares whether it did well or not. So here's to Francis Ford Coppola, the craziest and most financially irresponsible filmmaker of all time. Steven Spielberg, how Hollywood's golden boy took over cinema and accidentally ruined it. Steven Spielberg, the man, the myth, the reason your childhood was either magical, terrifying, or both, or boring. Here's the guy who made us afraid of sharks, believe in aliens, and cry over a wrinkly space goblin with a glowing finger. He's also the only director in history who can make a war movie that wins Oscars and a dinosaur movie that prints money in the same decade. But here's the thing about Spielberg. He's so good at making movies, he accidentally broke Hollywood in the process. He's like the scientist in his own movies. Brilliant, not brilliant. Visionary, not so much. And completely unaware that his creation will one day destroy everything he loves. Once upon a time, in the late 60s, Hollywood was run by old, tired men who thought the future of cinema was more musicals, more westerns, and absolutely zero originality. Then came Steven Spielberg, who also had zero originality, but who was a film prodigy. He snuck onto the Universal lot as a teenager, lied about having a job, and somehow convinced people to let him direct television episodes before he was old enough to rent a car. Then at 26, he made Jaws, which was in 1975. Jaws changed Hollywood forever, because Jaws wasn't just a great thriller, it was a monster. It made so much money that Hollywood executives suddenly realized, wait, what if we stopped making weird artsy movies and just made exciting, dumb fun for the masses? Boom! The summer blockbuster was born. And Spielberg? He became Hollywood's golden boy. The first total nerd to win the war against the cigar-chomping old guard. And then he did it again. In 1981, he gave us Indiana Jones, a character so cool that he made archaeology look sexy. But Spielberg wasn't just making blockbusters. Oh no. In 1982, he made America cry like they just found out Santa isn't real. I was 5 when E.T. the Extraterrestrial came out, and it was, like all of his movies, very forgettable. It was a movie that proved he could literally film a puppet with a light bulb in its finger and still make people sob uncontrollably. At this point, Spielberg was unstoppable. And then he made The Color Purple, which I haven't seen. And I doubt I would bet hard money that I will never watch it. Because nothing says I can do prestige cinema like adapting a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel after spending the last decade directing explosions and space aliens. And guess what? It worked. Spielberg got Oscar nominations. Hollywood respected him. But little did he know, he was slowly accidentally destroying, I don't know about accidentally, destroying cinema itself. There is a legal term called ignorati non excusat, which means ignorance is not an excuse. Then came Spielberg's reign of terror, also known as the 90s. By the time the 90s rolled around, Spielberg wasn't just making movies. He was creating cultural landmarks. Fucking doofus that he is. In 1993, he delivered 2 of his biggest films in the same year. Jurassic Park. The movie that convinced Hollywood that CGI could replace literally everything and everyone. And then Schindler's List, which bored the living shit out of me. It was the movie that convinced Hollywood that Spielberg could make you feel horrible whenever he wanted to. Oh, how I hate this guy. With Schindler's List, Spielberg officially transcended blockbuster entertainment and became a serious filmmaker. So naturally, his next move was Jurassic Park 2. I refuse to show any more pictures of his movies because I do not want to advertise for anything further. I never wanted to advertise for him in the first place, but you know what? Cinematic history requires that we review this asshole. Art history as well, just to see how far we've fallen in this century. Okay, so Jurassic Park 2, because Spielberg doesn't care about your expectations. He'll win an Oscar and then make a sequel where a dinosaur literally destroys San Diego like Godzilla on bath salts. Now, by this point, Spielberg was the most powerful man in Hollywood, but power corrupts, and soon his influence began warping cinema itself. Because Spielberg had done something dangerous. He perfected the blockbuster formula, and Hollywood, being Hollywood, saw dollar signs and went full leech mode. Suddenly, every studio wanted their own Spielberg. Every movie had to be a high-concept spectacle that appealed to everyone and offended no one. And worst of all, he fathered the bastard mutant Michael Bay. Well, that's one of the worst things of all. But the other worst thing of all is that Spielberg created the modern franchise era. Because guess who was mentoring a young director named George Lucas while all of this crap was happening? Yeah, Lucas is partially his fault too. So began the Spielberg industrial complex and the modern blockbuster nightmare. At this point, Spielberg could have politely retired like somebody who farted. He could have left Hollywood. He could have quietly left Hollywood untouched. A myth, a legend, a man who changed cinema forever, in some people's opinion. Instead, he decided, you know what? I think I'll just keep making movies forever. Saving Private Ryan in 1998, which apparently redefined war films forever, and which I fell asleep watching. AI, Artificial Intelligence, which I consider to be a Kubrick movie. Minority Report, never watched it. Tom Cruise made people paranoid about their own eyeballs. And then things got weird. Because Spielberg stopped being ahead of the curve. As if he ever was. His 2005 remake of War of the Worlds, I saw that in the theater. It was awful. And it was the first time people thought, wait, is Spielberg just making blockbusters out of habit now? Then came Indiana Jones and the Christum of the Kingdom Skull, a movie that proved even Spielberg wasn't immune to the franchise cash grab virus. At this point, Spielberg wasn't ruining Hollywood directly anymore. He had already won. Now Hollywood was just copying his greatest hits over and over again. And Spielberg? He saw the monster he had created and tried to course correct by creating the movie The Post and West Side Story. But let's be real. No matter how many Oscar bait films he makes, he will always be the guy who accidentally turned Hollywood into a giant IP factory. So, is Spielberg a genius or a cinematic supervillain? What is Spielberg's legacy? On one hand, he's the greatest living filmmaker, which is nothing to be proud of. The guy who makes movies better, bigger, and more emotional than ever before. On the other hand, his success convinced Hollywood to stop taking risks and just milk franchises until the sun burns out. Let's get one thing straight here, he's not a genius. Spielberg is the destroyer of modern cinema. In the process of making his pablum, he accidentally created the soulless blockbuster factory that now dominates Hollywood. Would Spielberg himself admit this? Probably not. He's too busy directing another Oscar bait movie while Hollywood keeps making soulless cash grabs using the very formula he perfected. Stephen, I'm speaking to you directly. It's not too late for you to make things, well, not right, but you need to destroy all your movies and go away. George Lucas, The Accidental Emperor of Hollywood, and How He Lost It All. The man, the myth, the billionaire nerd who accidentally created the most powerful film franchise of all time, and then spent the next 40 years slowly ruining it. He was supposed to be one of the movie brats, the scrappy young directors who wanted to make art in the 70s. Instead, he turned Hollywood into a theme park, sold his soul to the toy industry, and then rage quit filmmaking after a bunch of nerds yelled at him online. A long time ago, George Lucas was just a film school nerd with a dream to make weird experimental sci-fi films that nobody would understand. His first movie, THX 1138, which came out in 1971, was a bleak dystopian film where people had no hair, no emotions, and no chance of survival. Audiences saw it and said no thanks. So Lucas did what all great artists do when their art flops. He sold out immediately. Rumor is that Francis Ford Coppola egged him on a bit and said, just make a comedy. Try to make a comedy. So in 1973 he made American Graffiti, which was a nostalgic coming-of-age movie about teens, cars, and people who do nothing. And it was a massive hit, and studios suddenly loved him. I saw it once, and I don't remember a thing. And so with Hollywood finally listening, George Lucas pitched his dream project. And Hollywood hated it. They thought it was stupid nonsense. The actors had no idea what they were saying. The original cut was a disaster, so much so that his friends begged him to quit filmmaking. In fact, one of his friends, Brian De Palma, it was his idea for them to have an opening crawl in Star Wars, because he said nobody's going to have any clue what's going on. Anyways, George re-edited the film, threw in some John Williams music, and somehow, against all logic, Star Wars became the biggest thing in the history of cinema. And just like that, George Lucas became a god, accidentally. With the first Star Wars, he redefined Hollywood. With The Empire Strikes Back, he proved it wasn't a fluke. With Return of the Jedi, he introduced the Ewoks and started to get a little weird. By the 80s, Lucas was tired of directing. It was hard, it took effort. It required talking to actors, which he hated. So instead of making movies, he did the next best thing. He started selling toys. Lucas brilliantly or luckily kept the merchandising rights to Star Wars. And soon, Star Wars wasn't just a film series. It was a full-blown capitalist religion. And George Lucas, he wasn't a filmmaker anymore. He was a brand. And brands don't make art, they make money. He still did some writing and producing. He did Indiana Jones and Willow and Howard the Duck. But then in the 90s, he decided to direct again. In the 90s, CGI was the hot new thing, and George Lucas also had a company called Industrial Light and Magic. And so, sitting on his massive pile of money, he had an idea. What if I made 3 more Star Wars movies? George Lucas directed the prequels exactly as he wanted to. It turns out Lucas was never a great director. He was a great world builder, a great idea guy, but isn't everybody? Few of the concepts of the original trilogy were his own, and now, when left alone, with no one to tell him, "George, please stop," he made movies that felt like PowerPoint presentations starring CGI mannequins. Regardless of how you feel about the prequels, I personally liked them. Star Wars was still making money, until one day George had had enough, and in 2012 he quit. Sick of all the fan backlash, George Lucas did the most capitalist thing imaginable. He sold Star Wars to Disney for $4 billion. That's right, the nerd who fought against the Hollywood system sold his life's work to the biggest media empire on Earth, Empire. And then he got mad when they didn't use his ideas for the sequels. And then, of course, Disney proceeded to utterly destroy everything good about Star Wars. I think it was either Francis Ford Coppola or Brian De Palma who said that making Star Wars was the worst thing that ever happened to George Lucas, because before then he was making experimental artistic films. After selling the Star Wars brand, he said he was going to go back to making artistic experimental films. I don't think he did, or if he did, he didn't release them. He seemingly doesn't make movies anymore, which I don't really blame him for, considering that he's like 80. He just hangs out in his mansion, gives occasional interviews about how he's not totally bitter about Star Wars, and plays with his $4 billion of cash. Martin Scorsese, the man who made cinema cool, then made it hilariously uncool. Martin Scorsese. The name alone is enough to make any cinephile say, wow, this guy gets it. He's the director who gave us The Godfather's sibling, the king of gritty New York, and the man who made you feel like you were living in the underbelly of society, even if you've never been within 5 miles of a mobster. But here's the thing about Martin. He didn't just make films. He redefined films as a medium, and then, for some reason, spent the next 30 years making it harder for normal people to sit through his movies. Martin Scorsese, the man who made cinema feel like a 5-hour lecture on Italian cinema. In the early 70s, Martin Scorsese was the angry kid from New York with a camera and a chip on his shoulder about everything that wasn't real cinema. He wasn't interested in making Hollywood fluff. He wanted to make films that took you to the darkest corners of society. And how did he start? With a film called Mean Streets, a gritty little movie that launched his career and gave the world the dynamic duo of De Niro and Keitel, both of whom looked like they just walked out of a mobster's wet dream. It wasn't so much a film as it was a comedic, tragic exploration of how you can't trust anyone who's Italian and wearing a leather jacket. And this annoys me because I'm Italian descent and I was never very proud of Scorsese. The 70s were his wild, rebellious decade. Scorsese was all about pushing boundaries and making us uncomfortable, with Taxi Driver in 1976, for example. So then in the 80s, he made Raging Bull, which I watched once and I don't remember anything about it. It's about a boxer who becomes a loser. The Last Temptation of Christ, which I tried to watch. Martin went and made a film that got him excommunicated from Catholicism. I guess he got in trouble for that. Scorsese wasn't just making films at this point. He was making statements. His movies weren't just stories, which is what they were supposed to be. They were about what it feels like to be a man on the edge of sanity. His approach? Take a bunch of chaotic characters, throw them into situations that could only end in violence, betrayal, or both, and let the camera linger on the misery until you, the viewer, wanted to crawl into a hole and hide. Because, hey, that's what life's really like, right? But Scorsese didn't just stop at making gritty dramas about mobsters and troubled souls. He decided that every single person in a movie should suffer like they'd been hit with a frying pan of existential dread. You wanted more realism? Well, here you go. Half-baked psychology, long monologues about finding meaning in the meaningless, and camera angles that made you feel like you were trapped in a nightmare that had a runtime of 2 hours and 45 minutes. God, this guy bores me so much. Just making a video about him bores me to death. By now, Scorsese had cemented his place as the heavyweight champion of films about psychotic, self-destructive men. He had an Oscar, a godlike status in the world of cinema, and naturally, he wanted more. So what did Martin do? He went full throttle into historical epics and serious dramas and 3-hour films. If Scorsese made a movie, it was going to feel like you'd sat in a chair for 3 days straight with no bathroom breaks. Goodfellas, I don't really understand why everybody says the greatest movie ever made. I don't, whatever, it's a movie. It's a movie. Like, I remember when I was a kid, right? I'm Italian descent. I watched this movie and I'm like, this is just showing a bunch of guys being bullies, right? That's all this, it's just like machismo. Like, it's embarrassing. I mean, if you want to glorify Italians, there's better ways to do it. Mobsters aren't the best thing Italy's ever came up with. I mean, Italians created law, the law system, the legal system. It's almost unaltered since it was created, since they created it. They perfected it. Paintings, music, everything. Italians invented everything. America was named after an Italian. Amerigono, I forget what his name was. My favorite movie by Scorsese is called Kundun because it's about Buddhism, and I think Buddhism is really cool, and it's historically accurate, and it's just, you know, the thing about Scorsese is he's similar to Spielberg, where he's very, very good director, but he's no writer whatsoever. I don't think he's even tried to write anything. I've only seen Taxi Driver once. I can see why that could be considered good because it's got a point to it. Like, there's a meaning, you know, that like a former guy that was in the army, how he's got PTSD and how he's lost and how the system treats him like crap. Okay, so there's a point. There's like a moral to the story. Cape Fear was a pretty good horror movie, sort of like thriller. But again, there's no real meaning behind it. There's no like moral to the story. It's just a good movie. That's it. It's just good popcorn. Then he enters his Leonardo DiCaprio phase where he does Shutter Island, which I watched it. I thought nothing of it. Piece of crap. The Departed, okay, it's a switcheroo movie. Okay, great. And then Wolf of Wall Street. You know, these movies are so forgettable, I struggled to even remember them. Okay, so Gangs of New York, 2002, the film that tried to make the 19th century 5 Points area seem interesting. And it was, but it's also like watching a long, depressing episode of Survivor, New York edition. You know everybody's gonna die, you just don't know when. And who can forget the so-called masterpiece that is The Wolf of Wall Street? God, that movie sucked. Martin took everything we know about greed, excess, and the absolute worst people you could ever meet and turned it into a 3-hour orgy of cocaine, sleaze, and embarrassing dancing. No meaning whatsoever. That should be his, that's his monocle. It amounted to a movie about nothing, which could be said for all his movies. Moniker? And then he brought Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci back for The Irishman in 2019, which is essentially a movie about... I never watched it, I never will. Which is essentially a movie about old guys staring at each other for 3 hours. Wow. Never seen it. Never will. While the camera slowly pans around their faces like it's the last minutes of an art installation. That movie was 2.5 hours of men... I thought it was 3. Explaining how they felt in the 50s while everyone lost the ability to look remotely human. At this point, Scorsese was making movies not only pushing boundaries, but actively pushing the audience away. Because who doesn't want to sit through a film that feels like an elegy for the past, followed by 30 minutes of watching Robert De Niro's digital face trying to pretend he's 30? Martin Scorsese in the 2020s is like that old guy yelling at kids to get off his lawn while simultaneously streaming on Netflix. In a world dominated by superhero films and constant reboots, Martin has turned into the grumpy uncle who tells everyone that movies aren't movies anymore. The man who just a few years ago got into an all-out Twitter feud with Marvel fans, calling the films theme park rides. He's right about that, but what he's wrong about is that his movies are better than theme park rides, and claiming they had no artistic merit, as if he does have artistic merit. He doesn't have artistic merit. In a world where everything is a franchise and reboots are faster than Netflix can churn out content, Scorsese is the only one still shouting about the sanctity of the true film experience. Isn't that an oxymoron, a true film experience? Sure, we get it, Martin. Movies suck today. But do you have to remind us while you're in the middle of making the longest Netflix movie ever? The irony is not lost on anyone. Well, I think it's lost on many, in fact. So what do we make of Martin Scorsese's career? Well, he's undeniably a master of his craft, but his craft happens to suck. And he is also a man who spent decades making cinema so art house and bleak that half of the audience wasn't sure if they needed to book a therapy session after watching. His legacy is complex. He's the godfather of American cinema and the king of cinematic misery, whose work was so annoying that it inspired a generation of filmmakers who now only make movies about superheroes with no soul. But hey, at least Martin is still around yelling at kids to stop playing with their phones while they watch movies about CGI robots hitting each other. Brian De Palma, the man who invented cinema's most twisted obsession. Brian De Palma, the name whispers, suspense, but screams, "What the hell did I just watch?" If you're unfamiliar, De Palma is like the mad scientist of cinema who hated subtlety, adored violence, and had a mysterious obsession with mirrors. He's the director who took Hitchcock's brilliance, turned it up to 11, and then smashed the volume button over his knee. But don't let that fool you. De Palma didn't just want to entertain you. Oh no, he wanted to disorient, confuse, and traumatize you in ways you didn't even know you could be traumatized. In fact, if you've ever watched a movie and thought, well, that was unnecessarily gratuitous, you have Brian De Palma to thank. This is the twisted, strange, and often downright bizarre journey of Brian De Palma, the man who made suspense and violence his playground and then invited us all to watch. The birth of a voyeur. De Palma's career began with a small obsession, watching people. In 1968, De Palma unleashed the movie Greetings, which I haven't seen, but which is a film that was essentially about young men dodging the Vietnam War draft. It was a dark comedy, but it also set the stage for what would come, a fascination with surveillance, suspense, and psychological horror. But let's be honest, nobody really cared at this point. It was in the 70s when De Palma realized he could take Hitchcock's voyeurism obsession, that need to peek into other people's lives, and make it even more uncomfortable. His early films like Sisters, which I have never seen, and Phantom of the Paradise, which I've never seen, were weird and fascinating but didn't really break through in the way De Palma wanted. Sure, Phantom of the Paradise had a cult following, which I was not aware of, but it wasn't like he was winning Oscars or anything. He was just getting stranger. But then came Carrie. This wasn't just a film about a shy girl getting revenge. This was the moment De Palma finally realized he could make you squirm with every single frame. After Carrie became a surprise hit, De Palma was fueled by the idea that he could get away with almost anything. Violence, nudity, excessive camera angles, and the occasional shower scene that went a bit too far. His next film, The Fury, from 1978, which I have not seen, was essentially a sequel to Carrie without the same success. Power of telekinesis? Check. Over-the-top explosions and blood? Of course. But it wasn't Carrie. It was like a flawed attempt to make psychic powers seem like a cool superhero origin story. But it was still too weird for mass audiences. More obscurity. Then came Dressed to Kill in 1980, which could be summed up as Hitchcock's Psycho, but way more graphic, disturbing, and weirdly sexual. A woman is murdered in an elevator, and the camera lingers on her body like it's an exhibit in a museum of bad taste. A cross-dressing killer? And let's not forget the infamous shower scene that is probably more graphic than any film should ever need to be. But what did De Palma do? He doubled down. With each new film, De Palma redefined the concept of tension, not by getting us invested in the plot, but by getting us deeply uncomfortable in the process. He was making films that dared you to look away, but you couldn't. But I could. De Palma became a master of suspense, not in the Hitchcock sense of slow-building tension, but in the shock and awe sense, focusing on graphic violence, confusing camera angles, and enough weird sex scenes to make your parents uncomfortable. His style was deliberately insane, or intense, and he wasn't shy about it. By the 80s, De Palma was fully embraced as the director of disturbing, beautifully twisted films. Movies like Scarface in 1983 made him a legend among fans of excessive bloodshed, cocaine, and crime. I'd like to say, though, about Scarface, I think the majority of viewers do not understand the moral of the story, and I will lay it out right now. Oliver Stone wrote the screenplay for Scarface, and I think the important moral of the story, I love stories, the moral of the story is that you can't be Scarface if you've got even the tiniest semblance of a heart. Tony Montana was moving up in the world and he kept succeeding, except at the climax when he refused to kill a child. And that was the beginning of his downfall. The moral of the story was, if you think that you want to be a badass and an evil psychopath, you have to go all the way. And Tony Montana, he showed a heart, and that destroyed him. I find it absolutely sickening how all these hip hop artists, give me a break, adore the movie. Every one of them, their favorite movie is Scarface, and they don't even know what the hell it's about. Scarface was the go-to movie for anyone trying to understand how to screw up their life. It was a movie that was so shamelessly over the top that you were left wondering, how does this man still have a career? And yet, De Palma's obsession with excess, violence, and paranoia seemed to speak to the very core of 80s excess. He had this magical ability to make even a character's descent into madness feel incredibly stylish and visually overwhelming. But here is the twist. His films started to feel like parody, even when they were meant to be serious. Body Double, for example, 1984, a film that mixes voyeurism, softcore porn, and a really bad slasher plot. But De Palma still somehow tried to act like it was a serious thriller. At this point, his films had become such a combination of uncomfortable eroticism and twisted horror that it was hard to know whether De Palma was a true cinematic genius Actually, it wasn't hard to know. But or just a man who should never have been allowed near a camera in the first place. But that didn't stop him. In fucking 1987, he made The Untouchables, which was a crime drama that somehow became his only truly mainstream success, and probably the closest thing to a real Hollywood film that De Palma would ever make again. But of course, it still had his signature stamp of excessive violence and tension. This was a great movie, in my opinion, in terms of how great a movie can be. I don't know how to say his name. The composer, Morricone. Ennio Morricone wrote the music, which was like the best music ever. And there was a classic scene that he took, I think he took it from some movie called Potemkin, Battleship Potemkin. I don't know, about like a little baby carriage falling down the stairs. This movie was like as good of a movie as a movie can be. Which does not say much, but I mean, this is the best that movies get. The Untouchables. If you haven't watched it, you should watch it. The Fall of De Palma, the director who got lost in his own mirage. By the 90s, De Palma had officially entered the "I'm kind of a joke, but I still make weird shit anyways" phase of his career. I remember seeing Raising Cain in the theaters, starring John Lithgow, and it was pretty good. It was creepy and everything, and John Lithgow was wearing a dress at the end of the movie, kind of a nod to Psycho, I suppose. In Carlito's Way, which I didn't think much of, but I watched a documentary about Brian De Palma, where he basically says, not basically, he does say that this was the most perfect movie he ever made. And it didn't do well, but he can't think of how he could have done it any better. And I can relate to that, because as a wannabe artist myself, I often wonder, like, am I out of touch? I can do something that I think is perfect, a perfect work of art, and nobody has any interest in it. Oh, I didn't know this. So he made the Mission Impossible in 1996, which showed that De Palma still had style, but it was also clear that he was far more interested in cool shots than in building coherent plots. He continued to make films throughout the 2000s like Femme Fatale, I've never seen this crap, and The Black Dahlia, I don't know, maybe it's good. But by this time, he was basically a director with a reputation for making confusing, sexually charged thrillers that felt like bad dreams. It was like watching a once great artist dabbling in bizarre, poorly executed ideas, as if his obsession with mirrors, voyeurism, and violence became self-parody. What happened? Did the once great Brian De Palma just lose his mind? Or did he simply get too comfortable in his own twisted playground and forgot how to get out? Probably a little bit of both. So what do we take from Brian De Palma's career? Well, he redefined the thriller by turning voyeurism, violence, and confusion into art. He made some of the most disturbing stylized films ever seen in Hollywood. He screamed at the world saying, "I don't care if you understand this, I just want you to feel something." And maybe that's the most beautifully nihilistic thing a filmmaker could do. Brian De Palma's legacy is like a mirror. It's distorted, confused, and makes you question if you even want to look. But whatever you do, don't watch double at your parents' house. And definitely subscribe, because this is pissing me off. I make better videos than 99% of everything on YouTube, so you should subscribe, you awful human being.